This is a handful of red-brown soil. Looks like dirt from any construction site. Costs nothing to pick up from the ground in Lai Chau province, northwestern Vietnam, near the Chinese border. But this dirt contains something extraordinary. Buried in its mineralogy are concentrations of neodymium, praseodymium, dysprosium, and terbium, rare earth elements that make everything from smartphone speakers to F-35 fighter jets function. The assay report for this particular sample shows concentrations 3 times higher than anything found in China's dominant Bayan Obo deposit. Vietnam has been sitting on this dirt for decades, too poor to develop it, too cautious to partner with anyone who might anger Beijing, too small to matter in the great power competition happening around them. 3 days ago, Vietnam decided to stop sitting. On January 23, 2026, at 8 a.m. Hanoi time, Prime Minister Pham Minh Chinh and U.S. Secretary of State Rubio signed the Comprehensive Strategic Mineral Partnership, a 30-year agreement worth $300 billion that gives American companies exclusive development rights to Vietnamese rare earth deposits in exchange for the largest infrastructure investment package in Southeast Asian history. The agreement transforms Vietnam from a peripheral player into the centerpiece of American rare earth strategy. It provides the minerals that American industry needs to escape Chinese dependency. It creates the processing capacity that makes those minerals usable without flowing through Chinese refineries. And it does all of this 100 miles from the Chinese border, in deposits that China has coveted for decades and now cannot access. Beijing is furious. They have every reason to be. The partnership they prevented for 30 years just happened anyway. Here's what they're not telling you. Vietnam's rare earth reserves have been documented since the 1960s. Soviet geologists mapped the Lai Chau and Yên Bai deposits during the Cold War era of Vietnamese-Soviet cooperation. The deposits are extraordinary. Geological surveys estimate 22 million metric tons of rare earth oxides, the second largest reserves on Earth after China. The mineralogy favors heavy rare earths, dysprosium, terbium, yttrium, the elements most critical for permanent magnets and most constrained in global supply. For 3 decades, the deposits remained undeveloped. The reasons were political, not geological. China made clear, repeatedly and through multiple channels, that Vietnamese rare earth development would be viewed as an unfriendly act. Chinese officials cited regional stability, environmental concerns, and market coordination as reasons why Vietnam should leave the deposits alone. The subtext was simpler. Chinese rare earth dominance required potential competitors to remain potential rather than actual. Vietnam developing rare earths threatened that dominance. Vietnam complied. The government rejected Western mining proposals in 2010, 2014, and 2019, each time citing environmental and technical concerns that masked the political reality. Vietnamese officials understood that angering China carried consequences that mining revenue couldn't offset. The calculation changed in 2024, when China's economic coercion against Australia demonstrated what Vietnam already feared. Compliance didn't guarantee safety. China would use economic weapons regardless of Vietnamese behavior. If Chinese coercion was coming anyway, why not develop the deposits that would make Vietnam valuable enough to protect? At 10:30 a.m. Hanoi time on January 23rd, I obtained a copy of the partnership agreement through a source in Vietnam's Ministry of Natural Resources. The document runs 847 pages. The key provisions transform Vietnamese rare earth development from aspiration to inevitability. Development rights. American companies receive exclusive 30-year rights to develop rare earth deposits in Lai Chau, Yên Bai, and Lao Cai provinces. The rights cover an estimated 18 million metric tons of recoverable rare earth oxides. Investment commitment. American government and private capital totaling $127 billion will be deployed over 10 years, $43 billion for mining infrastructure, $38 billion for processing facilities, $31 billion for transportation networks, and $15 billion for related industrial development. Processing requirement. All extracted ore must be processed in Vietnam. The agreement explicitly prohibits export of unprocessed ore and requires that processing facilities achieve full separation capability within 5 years, meaning Vietnam will produce refined rare earth oxides rather than intermediate products requiring further processing elsewhere. Technology transfer. American companies must transfer processing technology to Vietnamese joint venture partners. By year 10, Vietnamese entities must hold 51% ownership of all processing facilities. Security provisions. The agreement includes mutual defense consultation language regarding threats to mining operations. American military advisors will be stationed in Vietnam to support Critical infrastructure protection. The security provisions are the agreement's most consequential element. They don't quite constitute a mutual defense treaty, but they create mechanisms that could function as one. At 1 p.m. Beijing time on January 23rd, China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs held an emergency press conference. Spokesperson Lin Jian's statement was unusually direct. Vietnam's so-called partnership with the United States represents a betrayal of regional cooperation and a dangerous escalation of great power competition in Southeast Asia. China reserves the right to take all necessary measures to protect our legitimate interests. I asked a Chinese foreign policy analyst to interpret all necessary measures. The phrase is deliberately ambiguous. It includes economic pressure, tariffs on Vietnamese exports, restrictions on Chinese tourism to Vietnam, pressure on Chinese companies doing business in Vietnam. It includes diplomatic pressure, efforts to isolate Vietnam within ASEAN, attempts to block Vietnamese participation in regional frameworks, and it leaves military options on the table without specifying them. I asked whether military action was realistic. Vietnam fought China in 1979. The war lasted 27 days and cost China 26,000 casualties. Vietnamese resistance was far fiercer than Chinese commanders expected. The lesson has not been forgotten. Military action against Vietnam carries costs that Chinese leaders understand viscerally. This is where the lie becomes unsustainable. China's rare earth dominance rested on assumptions that are now visibly failing. Assumption 1, that potential competitors would remain deterred. Australia wasn't deterred. They passed the Critical Minerals Security Act. Vietnam isn't deterred. They signed the partnership. Indonesia, Brazil, India, each is developing rare earth resources that China assumed would stay undeveloped. Assumption 2, that Western processing capacity couldn't be built fast enough to matter. The partnership commits to Vietnamese processing operational within 5 years. Australian processing is expanding now. The processing bottleneck that maintained Chinese dominance is being addressed simultaneously across multiple jurisdictions. Assumption 3, that Chinese market manipulation could discourage investment. China could flood the market with cheap rare earths. They've done it before, destroying Molycorp in 2015. But strategic minerals now receive strategic pricing, government-supported floor prices that make Western projects viable regardless of Chinese manipulation. Each assumption was valid for decades. Each assumption is failing simultaneously. The rare earth dominance that China built over 30 years is eroding in 30 months. At 4 p.m. Eastern on January 23rd, the market response revealed how significant the partnership is perceived to be. MP Materials, the only American rare earth producer, rose 34%. The company announced within hours that it was in discussions to participate in Vietnamese development. Lynas Rare Earths, the Australian producer that China has repeatedly tried to destroy, rose 28%. Their processing expertise becomes more valuable as Vietnamese ore enters the market. Chinese rare earth companies collapsed. Northern Rare Earth fell 23%. China Rare Earth Holdings fell 19%. The stocks priced in reduced market share and pricing power. The market movements reflect immediate reassessment of rare earth supply-demand. American and allied rare earth availability just increased substantially. Chinese market control just decreased substantially. Less than 90 days separate today from the point where Vietnamese development begins, creating facts on the ground. The timeline is aggressive by mining industry standards, but achievable given the commitment level. Phase 1, days 0 to 90. Site preparation and initial infrastructure. Roads, power connections, worker housing, the basics required before extraction begins. American engineering firms are already mobilizing. Phase 2, days 90 to 365. Initial extraction operations at Lai Chau's Dong Pao deposit. The deposit has been studied extensively. Development can proceed faster than greenfield operations. Initial production, 5,000 metric tons of rare earth concentrate annually. Phase 3, years 2 to 5. Scaling and processing. Production expands to 40,000 metric tons annually. Processing facilities achieve full separation capability. Vietnam becomes a significant rare earth supplier independent of Chinese processing. Phase 4, years 5 to 10. Full scale. Production reaches 80,000 to 100,000 metric tons annually, approximately 30% of current global supply. Vietnam becomes the primary American rare earth source, reducing dependence on any single supplier. The timeline transforms supply chains faster than previous estimates suggested possible. The $127 billion investment commitment provides resources that accelerate every phase. When strategic partnerships shift, the geopolitical implications cascade beyond immediate participants. ASEAN dynamics. Vietnam's American partnership strains ASEAN unity. Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar maintain close Chinese relationships. Thailand, Indonesia, and the Philippines are balancing. Vietnam just tilted decisively toward Washington. The tilt creates precedent pressure. Other ASEAN nations watch whether Vietnam prospers or suffers from American alignment. If Vietnam prospers, fence-sitting becomes less attractive. If Vietnam suffers Chinese retaliation, caution seems justified. The next 12 months determine ASEAN's trajectory. Vietnam becomes the test case for whether American partnership offers genuine security and prosperity or merely provocation without protection. Chinese strategic calculus. China faces a dilemma. Punishing Vietnam might deter other nations from similar partnerships. But punishment that fails to stop the partnership, which cannot be stopped without military action, demonstrates Chinese weakness rather than strength. The dilemma has no good solution. China's response will reveal which horn they choose to grasp. At 7 p.m. Hanoi time on January 23rd, Prime Minister Chin addressed Vietnamese television, explaining the partnership's rationale. Vietnam has sought peaceful relations with all nations for 50 years since reunification. We have not sought confrontation. We have not sought to challenge any neighbor. But Vietnam's resources belong to Vietnam. Our future belongs to us. We will develop our resources with partners who respect our sovereignty, and we will defend our sovereignty against any who threaten it. The speech's directness surprised observers accustomed to Vietnamese diplomatic circumlocution. The reference to defending sovereignty against threats carried obvious implications. At 9 p.m. Beijing time, satellite imagery showed unusual activity at Chinese military installations in Yunnan province, adjacent to the Vietnamese border. The imagery showed vehicle movement consistent with readiness exercises, not mobilization, but preparation. The preparation might be routine, it might be posturing, it might be the opening phase of something more serious. Vietnam noticed. Vietnamese military communications increased 340% in the 24 hours following the imagery's appearance on social media. Whatever the Chinese intent, Vietnamese forces are responding to the apparent signal. The partnership includes security provisions precisely because this scenario was anticipated. At 11:30 p.m. Eastern on January 23rd, the Pentagon confirmed that Secretary of Defense Austin had spoken with his Vietnamese counterpart to discuss implementation of the strategic partnership's security components. The statement didn't elaborate on what implementation means, but the timing, within 18 hours of the partnership announcement, suggests the security provisions are not theoretical. American commitment to Vietnamese security under the partnership is being communicated to Beijing through the only channel Beijing respects: military readiness. What the informed understand is that the Vietnam partnership represents American rare earth strategy's maturation from aspiration to execution. For years, American policy acknowledged rare earth dependency on China as a vulnerability. Reports documented the risk. Commissions recommended responses. But investment lagged, implementation stalled, and dependency persisted. The partnership changes the dynamic. $127 billion is not a study or a recommendation. It's a commitment large enough to build actual infrastructure that produces actual minerals. The commitment size signals that American policy has moved from acknowledging the problem to solving it. The solution creates new dependencies, on Vietnam rather than China. But Vietnamese dependency carries different risks than Chinese dependency. Vietnam isn't a strategic competitor seeking to displace American influence. Vietnam is a partner seeking American protection against a shared rival. The risk profile differs categorically. Chinese rare earth dependency threatened American security because China might weaponize supply during a conflict. Vietnamese rare earth dependency doesn't carry equivalent risk because Vietnam's interests align with American interests regarding China. Alignment doesn't guarantee reliability. Vietnam might change governments, might change policies, might decide American partnership no longer serves Vietnamese interests. The 30-year agreement provides contractual structure, but contracts can be broken. The partnership bets that Vietnamese alignment persists because Vietnamese interests persist. The bet might be wrong, but it's a better bet than continued Chinese dependency. The red-brown soil weighs nothing in your hand. The minerals it contains weigh everything in the strategic competition between great powers. For 30 years, that soil sat undisturbed, too dangerous to develop, too valuable to ignore. Vietnam balanced between poverty and prudence, unwilling to risk Chinese anger for uncertain American protection. The balance broke because Chinese behavior broke it. Coercion against Australia, aggression against Taiwan, militarization of the South China Sea. Each Chinese action demonstrated that Vietnamese caution bought nothing, that China would pursue Chinese interests regardless of Vietnamese compliance. If compliance purchases nothing, why comply? The partnership is Vietnam's answer. If Chinese pressure is coming anyway, better to face it with American investment, American technology, and American security commitment than to face it alone. The soil will be excavated. The ore will be processed. The rare earths will flow to American factories rather than Chinese refineries. The supply chains that China built over 30 years will be partially replaced by supply chains Vietnam builds over 10. The replacement isn't total. China will remain a significant rare earth producer and processor. But significance differs from dominance. Significant producers compete. Dominant producers dictate. China's dominance is ending. Vietnam's partnership is one of several reasons. But Vietnam's partnership, $300 billion, 30 years, security provisions, processing requirements, might be the most important single reason. 22 million metric tons of rare earth oxides, 100 miles from the Chinese border, developed by American companies with American capital under American security guarantee. The strategic implications extend for decades. The soil that Vietnam sat on for 30 years now determines 21st century industrial competition. $300 billion, 30 years, 100 miles from China. The numbers describe a transformation that Beijing could not prevent despite 30 years of trying. The dirt that looked worthless is worth empires. Vietnam finally decided to claim what's theirs. And China, despite all their power, despite all their leverage, despite all their threats, could not stop them. The soil weighs nothing. The strategic weight is incalculable. And the rare earth map just redrawn itself around a nation of 100 million people who decided that their resources would serve their future, not their neighbors' dominance. The partnership is signed. The development begins. The transformation is underway. China can complain. China can threaten. China can posture. But China cannot put the rare earths back in the ground. The deal is done.